Fortunately, I have a computer printer that works very well on cardstock. Just print my patterns directly from the pattern file onto heavy cardstock. If you have to start with a pattern printed on paper, make a copy first so you can still use the pattern if you lose a piece. If you have a computer printer that only prints well on paper, print your patterns directly from the pattern file onto plain paper. Then use a glue stick to paste the paper pattern on a used file folder, and then use a brayer or anything that works to smooth it out to remove any air bubbles that might be there. Allow it to dry completely and then cut out the pieces just as if they had been printed on heavy cardstock. The sewing lines on my patterns are exactly 2 points thick. I usually cut either down the center of the line or cut the line off entirely. It's only 1/36 of an inch, 0.07 millimeters, so it doesn't make much difference as long as you are consistent, and the marker usually has a fat point. Cut away all the darts and snip the circles slightly so that you can mark these details perfectly into the fabric. Snipping the circles will allow the marking pen to dip slightly into the fabric to mark your beginnings and stopping stitching lines. It is easier to cut out the ears pattern as a square and then cut out the ears, removing the black line from the square. When tracing the ears onto the fabric, draw inside the template. This prevents losing those tiny ear patterns. There are several places left open for easier stuffing. These tiny guide marks will remind you to stop stitching. I use these tiny guide marks to draw a straight line straight out across the seam allowance to remind me to stop stitching. Follow the grain arrows indicated on the pattern pieces. They always point in the direction where the fabric stretch needs the most control, so that your doll will come out the same size as mine. The arrows always indicate the direction of the least stretch. This is along the length or straight of the goods, or parallel, same direction as, the selvage or self-edge of the fabric. Occasionally, the pattern piece has been rotated so that the stretch will be on the bias, or diagonal direction, which has the most stretch. This is necessary when doing things like small faces and hands. For the face shown here, there are 2 different directional arrows, one for woven fabric on the bias and one for knit fabric on the straight of the goods. The reason for this is that knit fabric stretches much more than woven fabric. Note that the arrow doesn't rotate, just the pattern piece. Pay attention to which way the arrow goes on the fabric. It always goes along the length of the goods, in the direction of the least stretch, parallel to the selvage. When you buy a dress pattern, it comes marked with cutting lines for several sizes. You cut the pattern at the line for your size, and then add seam allowance inside the cut edge by lining the cut edge up with the groove in your sewing machine's cover plate or with the edge of the general purpose foot, which is not good for doll making. You don't have to be able to see the sewing line, as long as you keep the fabric lined up with the correct groove or the edge of the general purpose foot. This works fine for something as big as a person. A 1/16 of an inch error won't mess up the fit of a dress too much. It doesn't work at all well for something as small as a doll. A 1/16 of an inch error may result in a doll that is 1/2 inch too fat or too thin to fit her clothes. When you make a doll, you start with a template that is the exact size of the doll piece. You trace the sewing line around the outside of the template. Then you use a dream seamer to add a perfect seam allowance by making the cutting line outside the sewing line. You sew the doll by keeping the needle exactly on the sewing line, so you have to be able to see the sewing line. The correct presser foot helps make this easy. Align arrows on each pattern piece with the straight of the goods. Move pieces around to get the most from the fabric, or to get the easiest to cut layout for your working area, keeping the arrows lined up at all times. Leave at least a 1/2 inch, 15 millimeters, between pieces for seam allowance. It's okay to waste a little fabric to make cutting easier. For example, if you cut the torso pieces together and then make the torso, and then you cut the leg pieces together and then make the legs, and so on. I have included a little extra in the materials to allow you to do this. Place your pattern pieces on the fabric as indicated. For single or doubled fabric, right sides together or wrong sides together, on a fold or not on a fold. Make sure the arrow on each pattern piece points in the correct direction. In other words, read the instructions on the pattern piece. There's lots of information there. Mark around each pattern piece with the purple air-soluble pen. This is the sewing line. Use the dream seamer to mark around each pattern piece again. This single hole disc will mark exactly a 1/4 inch seam allowance. This is the cutting line. See the sources section of this video to find out where to get one. Since this will get cut off anyway, you can use a pencil to save your expensive purple pen. Mark all circles, darts, and construction details as indicated on each pattern piece. You're going to need them to make everything fit together correctly. All seam allowances are 1/4 inch 6 millimeters unless otherwise indicated. If it is otherwise indicated, it will say so directly on the pattern piece. After sewing, trim all seam allowances in half to 1/8 inch, 3 millimeters, unless otherwise indicated. Notch seam allowances at inner curves and clip outer curves to make them lie flat when the piece is turned right side out. To notch seam allowance, fold over your finger, remove your finger and grasp the fold with your thumb and forefinger, and then cut just before the seam. To snip seam allowance, cut a slit almost to the seam. Where 4 pieces come together, such as the seam at the top of a 4-piece head, or at the center of the bust and upper torso and lower torso, cut away almost all seam allowance so you don't get a glitch from having too much cloth when you assemble the pieces, or getting something in there that doesn't belong there in the first place. It's very difficult to remove. Several pieces are much easier if you stitch the seams before you cut the pieces out. On the torso head, the center front and center back seams are done before cutting. Where it's easier to sew before cutting, the seam line on the pattern piece will tell you this. Look for it. Stitch exactly on the stitching line. If you make the pattern smaller, precision is more critical. If you make the pattern larger, you can afford a little bit of sloppiness. Be sure to start and end stitching by going all the way across the seam allowance and off the fabric. The exceptions are mentioned specifically when you need to know about it. I repeat this several times because there are many quilters out there who can't remember to do this. When backtacking is critical, I will tell you and show you how.